Hello, I'm Keith Hocton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Hello, let me take you, if I may, into one of my favourite rituals. Every time I'm in London, I find myself drawn almost irresistibly to the National Gallery. Not just for the paintings, though I will come to those, but for the whole immersive experience. You know, the cafe, the restaurant, the sense of stepping out of the modern world and into something slower, richer, faintly more civilized. There's something about this building, the soft echo of footsteps, the murmur of voices, the way the light shifts as you move from room to room, that makes you feel as though time itself has been gently slowed. But of course, it's the paintings that pull you in. The National Gallery, like many of the paintings it houses, wasn't born in a single moment, but it actually grew into itself over time. Its original form actually was completed in 1838 under the hand of William Wilkins, and he designed the neoclassical facade that still looks out over Trafalgar Square today. Yet, when you walk through now, it's far richer. It's a far more layered creation. And it's been expanded steadily through the 19th and 20th centuries as the art collection has swelled before taking a bold step, I have to say, into modernity with the addition of the Salisbury wing, which was opened in 1991. And that's a space now that houses some of the earliest treasures of the Renaissance, so that the building itself becomes a quiet reflection of its contents. A structure, if you like, shaped not in a single act of creation, but through centuries of accumulation, ambition, and of course, very, very careful reinvention. To me, paintings are history kind of caught in the act. And more than that, they're actually riddles. I've always been drawn to that sense of mystery. The novels of David Bliss, for instance, they do this beautifully. A fully realized world, but with something hidden just beneath the surface. And very often there is a painting at the center of it. There's a clue, a doorway, something that sends you down a rabbit hole that you hadn't planned on entering. And it's that spirit, that sense of stepping into something half seen, that I want to take you into, and I want you to experience what I experienced through a handful of paintings, not as pictures, but actually as historical problems. And I'd like to begin with the Arnolfini portrait, or depending on your mood, the Arnolfini wedding, the Arnolfini double portrait, or half a dozen other names that it's had, at least during my lifetime, which tells you, I think, something very important straight away. Nobody over the centuries has ever quite agreed on what it actually is, which is why I'm so drawn to this particular painting. It was painted in 1434 by Jan van Eyck, and I think it's one of the most important works in Western art. Not because it's simply beautiful, because it is, but because it quietly changes how paintings work. It's also surprisingly small. People expect something grand, but in reality, it's modest, about 1.5 feet by 2 feet. And yet there it hangs in London, drawing crowds rather like the Mona Lisa in Paris. It's a small painting with an enormous mystery. And part of that mystery lies in the painter, Jan van Eyck. And he's actually often credited with perfecting oil painting. And what he achieves here, I think, is extraordinary. Not just because of the obvious detail, the gleam of brass, the softness of fur, the weight of cloth, but in the way light itself seems to settle on the surfaces. Oil paint, unlike tempera, dries very slowly. It allows for layering, for subtle transitions, for depth that earlier painters simply couldn't achieve. And Van Eyck uses that to create something almost uncanny, a world that feels not painted, but actually observed. And yet, and this is the intriguing thing about this particular painting, the meaning doesn't. So let me sketch it for you, all puns aside. A couple stand in a room in 15th century Bruges, a city at its height, one of the great trading centres of Europe, where fortunes are made not in land, but in cloth, banking and quiet agreements behind closed doors. Merchants here deal not just in goods, but in trust, in contracts, in relationships that stretch across the continents. Behind them, a heavy red bed, almost theatrical in its richness. A symbol not just of domestic life, but of wealth, of status, of a household established and secure. In the center, there are two figures themselves, joined, or so it seems, by their hands. But are they holding hands? At first glance, you'd say yes, but look again. The man extends his left hand palm upward. The woman places her right hand directly into his. It's not a mutual clasp, not quite intimacy, something far more formal, something far more deliberate. Art historians actually call this dextrarium unctio, effectively the joining of hands, a gesture of union, of agreement, even marriage. Except, of course, it isn't any of those, because he is actually offering his left hand and not his right. And it's a tiny detail that actually changes everything. Now let's just look at him. He cuts a remarkable figure, a vast black hat, almost architectural in its size, perched above a very pale, controlled face. And there's something in the expression, watchful, faintly severe, that feels oddly familiar, though I can't actually tell you why. Then there's the fur-lined coat, the velvet beneath. Every inch of him speaks of status. This man is advertising his wealth. And I think also perhaps something else, control. And opposite him, the woman, quieter, more elusive. Is she his wife? Is she his mistress? Is she something else entirely? For centuries, art historians have actually identified her as Giovanna Sonami, and the painting was read as a wedding. But the dates actually don't fit. Her documented marriage takes place 13 years after the painting was commissioned. So we're actually left with that uncertainty. Most scholars still lean towards the idea that she is a wife, perhaps an earlier one, or even more hauntingly, a presence rather than a person, somebody already gone, a memory rendered with the same precision as everything else in the room. But the painting never tells us, and I think that's the point. So with that in mind, what's actually happening here? The man raises his hand in a gesture that feels instantly familiar. Two fingers lifted, almost Christ-like, offering a blessing. But again, certainty slips away. Is he blessing? Is he swearing? Is he taking an oath? Or simply adopting a pose that signals seriousness, authority, intent? We don't actually know. And the woman, wrapped in that extraordinary green dress, yards of fabric gathered and lifted. To modern eyes, she actually appears pregnant, but she's not. This is the fashion. In the late 15th century, wealth was actually displayed through excess cloth. By lifting the fabric, she creates that rounded shape, which to her contemporaries would have signaled prosperity and refinement. To us, it tells a different story. And this is one of the quiet tensions of this particular painting. It speaks in a language we only half understand. And notice this, they're not quite looking at each other. Their gazes hover slightly off, as if they share the same space, but not the same moment. Then your eyes begin to travel to the floor, the wooden patterns, those overshoes for the mud, set aside, still marked by the outside world, a reminder that something has been left at the threshold. At the very front of the painting, there's a small dog, lively, almost mischievous, not solemn at all. And if this is a sacred moment, it's an oddly irrelevant witness. Dogs often symbolize loyalty, but this one feels almost too alive, too present, as though it belongs to a different kind of story altogether. And then the oranges, They're bright, they're deliberate, and of course, they're very expensive. Quiet signals of wealth in a northern city where oranges didn't grow. They're imported, they're rare. A statement placed casually, I think, within the frame. So everywhere you look, there are clues, but none of them quite agree. And then at the back of the room, the detail that changes absolutely everything. There's a convex mirror. It's small, it's easily missed, and yet once you see it, it's impossible to ignore. It actually expands the space beyond what we can see, because in it, there are two tiny figures that stand in the doorway behind the couple. One is almost certainly Jan van Eyck himself, and that's confirmed by the inscription above, which actually says, Johannes de Eyck fruit hic. Jan Eyck was here. Not painted by, was here. You know, it's a subtle but profound shift. This isn't just a work of art. It's actually a record of his presence. But then you wonder, who's the second figure? A witness? An observer? Someone required for a legal act? Or someone whose identity mattered very much at the time and not at all to us now? Because the mirror does something extraordinary. It turns the painting back on us. So we are no longer just looking, we're actually standing where they stood. We become the witnesses. And suddenly the painting feels less like an image and more like an event, something that happened, something we have arrived too late to fully understand. And above it all stands the chandelier, vast, ornate, ruinously expensive, a definite statement of wealth hanging over the scene, much like a crown. But it's the candle in the chandelier that matters, one single flame, and it's burning in daylight, so it's completely unnecessary, which means it's very deliberate. Some see it as the presence of God, others as something darker, a marker of life, or of its absence. Or perhaps simply it's just a flame that has no business being there, which is precisely why it matters. And when you take a step back, the effect is curiously unsettling. This doesn't feel like a celebration. It actually feels arranged, controlled, almost staged. The raised hand suggests blessing, but without warmth. The joined hands suggest union, but not intimacy. Everything is precise. Everything is fixed. The mirror watches, the figures linger, and the candle burns. And I think what we're left with is not a fleeting moment of life, but something closer to a record, a contract, perhaps even a memorial. And 600 years later, they haven't moved. And I think perhaps that's the point. So if you find yourself there, don't just stop with the Arnolfini portrait. Walk a little further and stand before the ambassadors, where wealth, power, and knowledge are laid out with almost unsettling precision, only to be undermined by that strange, distorted skull that reminds you quietly but insistently that all of this will eventually end. Then turn to the fighting Temeraire, where a great warship, once glorious, is towed away to be broken up. A farewell not just to a vessel, but to an entire age of heroism and empire. Its fading light captured in one of the most haunting skies ever painted. And finally, before you leave and you step out into Trafalgar Square, seek out Bacchus and Adrienne, which at first seems to explode with color and movement, but beneath it lies something more fragile, a moment of sudden encounter, of love, of abandonment, caught just before it slips away. 3 paintings, 3 very different worlds, but each of them in its own way asking the same question, I think. What lasts? What disappears? And in that sense, they're not so different from the Arnolfini couple, still standing, still silent, still refusing to explain themselves. That's why paintings matter. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepopublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.